Good morning. My name is Gregory Carr. I am a public historian. I am also very interested in racial disparity issues, particularly as it relates to Southern Illinois, and I just wanted to shed some light on racial disparities in housing in Southern Illinois. And one of the claims I would like to make just to begin is simply this. Racial disparity in housing in Southern Illinois has adversely impacted African Americans' ability to cultivate and maintain generational wealth in perpetuity for the African American community. This, as Ms. Taylor has stated, is not debatable. It is simply historical fact. And I just wanted to provide a framework of some particularly definitions that will help us to go along with everything that's going to be said today, because we hear a lot about terms. And as a historian, I am very concerned and also adept at defining very abstract terms. So three of the terms we're going to be dealing with are, of course, redlining, racial restrictive covenants, and sundown towns. First, let me give a definition of redlining from the Federal Reserve history. Quote, redlining is the practice of denying people access to credit because of where they live, even if they are personally qualified for loans. Historically, mortgage lenders once widely redlined core urban neighborhoods and black populated neighborhoods in particular. The 1968 Fair Housing Act outlawed racially motivated redlining and tasked federal financial regulators, including the Federal Reserve, with enforcement, end of quote. One particular aspect I'm also interested in as an educator, I am also an educator. I had a wonderful opportunity to still continually work for an organization called First Class Educator. And First Class Educator was able to win a contract with the Decatur Public School Systems, DPS 61. So I have a lot of work experience in the Illinois area, particularly Southern Illinois. Also, I am a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, so I've had a chance to live in the Southern Illinois and East Central Illinois communities. And one of the things that we noticed that we brought to the attention of the teachers that we were doing the educational consulting for was many of them did not know that they lived in an area that had been redlined. Not only just redlined since 1934. The entire process, the housing process, began in the 1930s during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Unfortunately, black people were left out of the New Deal. And as a result, their neighborhoods were redlined and they did not get the loans, thus impacting their ability to generate and cultivate generational wealth to pass on to their children and grandchildren. When we started having conversations with the teachers in the school district, they didn't understand why certain areas in Decatur were so negatively impacted. And when we showed them this incredible map, I wish I was able to show it to you, but maybe I'll share it at a later time. But there's an incredible map of Decatur that shows areas which are very green, which receive great amounts of credit and loaning and housing. And then there were other areas that were yellowed out that were less so than blue. And then finally the red areas, which demonstrated the high concentration of African American families. Once the educators saw this map, were given a visualization of what it meant to be left on the outside of economic empowerment, many of them started to empathize with their students to understand why some of them were not as adept at learning their school lessons and is not as adept at managing their personal lives, because they were living in depressed areas in a city like Decatur, which is very wealthy in and of itself. So you almost have these two segregated and separate Americas. One very upscale and very wealthy, living on one end of the town with magnet schools and charter schools and all the best schools, and on the other end of town, a very, very depressed area. And in many cases, when there is no economic empowerment, crime will naturally come in to fill that void. My second point is on restrictive covenants or racially restrictive covenants. Definition. Racial covenants are clauses that were inserted into property deeds to prevent people who were not white from buying or occupying land. And this comes from the Fannie Mae website that emphasizes in housing. So if we're looking for a test case, even though this is in St. Louis, it also was a landmark case that impacted the idea of racial restrictive covenants. We don't have to look back any further to the Shelley versus Kramer case in 1948 in St. Louis. J.D. Shelley was a gentleman from Mississippi who wanted to buy a house in North St. Louis, and that time was predominantly white. He had a friend show up to pose as him, purchase the property, and the housing association accepted the offer. And then the next day, J.D. Shelley and his family started moving in. There was a big ruckus, and the next thing you know, they said, well, we don't honor this purchase because we don't allow Negroes to move into our neighborhood. It was disputed and taken to the St. Louis Circuit Court, and then it eventually went to eventually to the Missouri Supreme Court that overruled the St. Louis Circuit Court, and then it was appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And it was a very interesting decision because several of the Supreme Court justices, not unlike today, recused themselves from voting simply because they lived in neighborhoods that had racially restrictive covenants. And so Mr. Shelley was able to win his case that pretty much struck down legally racially restrictive covenants, even though people still tried to exercise them privately. The 1968 Fair Housing Act actually became a federal law that outlawed it. In my neighborhood in St. Louis, we had a very similar situation in a small area in Normandy called Pasadena Hills, one of the 24 municipalities that make up Normandy. And so we actually have these racially restrictive covenants still written into the deeds, even in 2002. Many places like Kirkwood, after the particularly tragic events of their shooting at City Hall, decided to erase and eradicate the language of racially restrictive covenants, and we actually pushed forward and were very successful. And I want to just very briefly read what we said as neighbors, and I want to encourage you that this is something that we as community members came up with to eradicate the situation. And I read, "We, the residents of Pasadena Hill, exercising the highest principles of American democracy, acknowledge, repudiate, and expunge the term indentured restrictions, heretofore known as restrictive covenants and racial deeds, from the deeds of this city. Although restrictive covenants have been deemed unconstitutional by Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 and nullified by the Fair Housing Act 1968, restrictive covenants were created to discriminate and divide Americans by class, race, ethnicity, cultural, and religious differences. Such documents have no place in a more democratic society, but are more appropriate to be displayed in online archives, history books, and museums to become artifacts for future generations to reflect upon." End of quote. My final point, it deals with sundown towns. Sundown town is defined as a municipality or neighborhood that practices or has historically practiced a form of racial segregation, often characterized by hostility, intimidation, or violence towards non-whites, particularly African Americans. The term stems from the practice of white towns using signs to require non-whites to leave the area by sunset. These towns often had a history of violently displacing African American residents and seizing their property. Another point of transparency, I also worked in Southern Illinois, in Carbondale, Illinois, for 2 years. I formerly worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car as a branch manager and area manager for the company. And one of my employees told me, as a new employee in Southern Illinois, there were some rules that I had to observe. And this is 1994, mind you. And I said, what are those rules? He said, well, if you go to certain places outside of Carbondale, particularly south of Carbondale, you should be out of there by 5 o'clock. And I said, in 1994, I said, you're kidding me, right? This is 1994. He said, no. He said, in fact, he said, there's one particular place, and you may be familiar with it, and he said, it's only about 20 miles south of Carbondale, and it's called Anna, Illinois. And he implored me not to stay there past 5 o'clock. I said, why? It is a sundown town. He said, it absolutely is a sundown town. And he went on to explain to me that Anna wasn't just only a personal name of a woman. He intimated that it might have been an acronym for Ain't No N-Words Allowed. I decided to observe that warning until one day I was doing sales calls. Now, you have to understand that Anna and Jonesboro are twin cities in that particular area. Anna is predominantly populated by whites. Jonesboro is predominantly populated by blacks. When I arrived there around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I saw both races mixing and having conversations. So I said, maybe this is just a myth. Maybe they're overthinking it. At 4 o'clock, I saw fewer and fewer blacks. And by 5 o'clock, my guest, who was an insurance agent, said to me, don't you think it's time for you to go? I said, why? We were having a great conversation. Why do you think? He said, well, I just think you probably need to get home and have dinner because I need to also. And when I looked out the window, there were no blacks on the street at that time. And I was the only black person in 1995 standing out on the street. So I decided to push it just a little bit further. And I went to the local McDonald's and was going to go through the drive-thru. But I said, no, I'm going to walk in. So I walked in with my nicest corporate outfit, nice trench coat, and the entire place went silent as I walked in. And they could tell that I was not one of theirs. So I say this to conclude that racial disparity in housing, particularly in Southern Illinois, continues and has in the past, and if we don't do something about it, will continue to impact adversely financial and generational wealth for blacks in Southern Illinois. Hopefully I've outlined some very salient points, defined some critical issues that you as citizens can very simply do by raising your voices, organizing like we are doing today, and having conversations on how we can eradicate this in the future. Thank you.